I'm Natalie. I work with the Archaeoastronomy Survey of Southeast Utah. We're a two-man operation, and we've been doing it for about 10 years, so pretty exciting work out of kind of the Bears Ears region, though mostly Cedar Mesa, Comb Ridge, that kind of stuff. So, first of all, I want to start off by asking you guys a question. Who has been in Akiva? Not quite everybody raised their hand, but almost. Okay, so you're in this Kiva, and in front of you there's maybe a keyhole, probably a ventilator, maybe a deflector, definitely a fire hearth, if you can see it. Sipapu, pilasters. Over you there might be the roof, if you're lucky, and probably the roof hatch. And all of those things most likely line up. They're kind of indicating a single direction. We call that the Kiva Orientation. We tried calling it the Kiva axis, but then we got into plural and axes, and somebody said, well, are you talking about, axe heads that you find in Kivas? And so Kiva Orientation, that's what I'm gonna call it. All right, so most often archaeologists, when they talk about and write about Kiva orientations, they kind of say, well, it's southeast, it's southwest, it's south, it's east. They don't get very specific. But we, as archaeoastronomers, we're measuring things, we're measuring lines. And so we started looking at these Kivas, and we said, we can be more specific than that. We're interested in, 1 to 2 degrees. What's it pointing at? And we're fortunate in that we're in southeast Utah, so we have lots of canyons. And so we have lots of preserved Kivas, so we can still see all of those floor features, or some of them at least, and the wall structures and the roofs and that kind of thing, without having to excavate a single cubic inch of dirt. So far, we've managed to get the orientations down to about 1 or 2 degrees of 95 Kivas. Of those 95, 94 are in cliff dwellings. One is on the mesa top. And so with that data set, we're kind of able to start to see some trends. Let's see. So we have 51 of those that we can't explain at all. No idea what they were thinking. But we have 10 that they're looking at the landscape. So they're orienting so that they're looking at the intersection of 2 canyon rims or a big hoodoo in the canyon, something like that. We have 5 that are looking at the rise or set point of the winter solstice sun. We have 3 that are looking at the rise or set point of the cross-quarter sun in the winter. So you heard Brian Bates kind of talk about the cross-quarter, halfway between the equinox and the solstice, an important ceremonial date. We have, 4 that are lunar, so they're looking at the south major lunar standstill, kind of a generational event. And then we have 13 that are cardinal south. So they're looking straight south. You probably expected that. People say that all the time. They look south. Well, 13 of these actually do. And then what are most common is kind of strange, and it really confused us for a long time, because 16 of these Kivas are looking just west, just east of south. They're 10 degrees off. They're pointing at 170 degrees instead of 180. And we said, well, what's that about? So we kind of thought, well, maybe it's stars, blah, 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 blah. Maybe it's shadows, kind of, but we eventually decided all that was not going to work. And so we talked to a friend, John Fountain, another archaeoastronomer down in Tucson, and he said, well, other cultures in the world, kind of prehistoric, they looked at vertical star alignments, so 2 or more stars that line up vertically in the sky. And the benefit of that is it indicates the same horizon position regardless of where you are on Earth, which is pretty cool. So as long as you can see that constellation, no matter what your latitude or longitude, it indicates that same horizon position. So they could get 170 whether they're sitting down in Arizona or whether they're up in New Mexico or whether they're in Utah. They could get it. So with that kind of tip-off, I looked at some astronomy software and said, well, look at this. In the 11 and 1200s, and you look at 170, there's the Sword of Orion. So do you know where Orion is? You know what it looks like? Generally, there's the arms and the legs, but the Pueblos, they kind of look at the belt. So the three big stars of the belt, yeah, you're looking at like that. And then below it, kind of catty corner, there's the sword. It's three little star clusters off to the bottom. And so when those three go vertical, that's 170, or it was back in the day. And so, collecting myself. Okay, so those three stars. So we said, okay, so that's pretty cool, but is it showing up in the ethnography? Like, were they still doing it later? We were pretty convinced that it was pretty solid, even just with the field work. I mean, it makes sense, but is there evidence that they're actually using that in ceremonies? And so, looking at kind of Alexander Stephen and Elsie Cluse-Parsons and Frank Waters, we managed to find that, indeed, Orion is one of the few that they did talk about with ethnographers in history. And so we found that this time of year, they come out of the Kivas and they look toward the east at the rising of Orion to kind of time their ceremonies. So they're using it as a clock in the middle of the night. So we're looking at the rising of Orion. But then, 6 weeks later, around the equinox, they go into the Kivas, and they're looking out through the roof hatch. The women are. The women are in there looking out through the roof hatch, and they describe it as toward the south. So nowadays, Orion's sword turns vertical at about 175. So they're looking generally toward the south. The ethnographer wouldn't know any better. So we have them looking at it at the equinox. We have them... and then 6 weeks later, in early November, around that cross-quarter date, we have accounts of the Two-Horn Society chief and his assistant sitting in the Kiva, looking out through the roof hatch, and looking for three stars of Orion aligning with the roof hatch. That's how it's described. And I'm like, oh, holy grail! You got the field work, and you got the evidence, and you got the ethnography, and it's all lining up, and it's all saying exactly the same thing. So it was pretty awesome. So we don't have quite as tight a description of them doing it during the winter solstice, but I'm pretty sure there's just nobody wrote it down, but I think they're probably doing it there too. So, how long do I have? A couple minutes. Okay. So we started looking at the kind of the distribution of where those three ceremonies, the equinox, the cross quarter, and the winter solstice, are being celebrated in relation to these 170 kivas, to say, okay, what were they doing where? The 170 kivas tend to end up in one per canyon, generally, sort of. There are a few cases where there's two in close proximity to one another. We have three of those. And so kind of looking at, based on the other evidence we see archaeoastronomically, what ceremonies were they doing in those 170 kivas? And we see that in some cases they're doing all three of those ceremonies in the one kiva. In other cases, they're doing different ceremonies in the different kivas. So that's pretty intriguing. So basically, what I'm saying is, you all need to measure your kivas. Because if we have a greater data set, if we can look at, if we can go back to pit houses and see what they were doing with pit houses, is it similar or is it different? If we can say, well, in Arizona, they're doing something totally different, they're not doing this at all, we can start to not only put different clans in different kivas and different ceremonies in different kivas, but we can start to disseminate it across a larger landscape if everyone measures their kivas. So that's what I'm charging you with now. And I think I'm about timed. So.